He thought he had taken everything from her. Her confidence, her money, and her future. Bryce Morgan walked into that Boston courtroom wearing a $5,000 suit, convinced that his wife's empty defense table meant an easy victory. He laughed when the judge asked for her lawyer. He mocked her silence. But he didn't know who was waiting in the hallway. He didn't know that the phone call his wife made the night before wasn't to a legal aid clinic, but to a woman the legal world hadn't seen in 20 years. A woman known simply as the guillotine. When those courtroom doors opened, the laughing stopped forever. This is the story of how an arrogant husband lost everything in a single afternoon. The air inside courtroom 4B of the Suffolk County Family Court was stale, smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper. It was a suffocating atmosphere, one that usually smelled of desperation, but today from the petitioner's table it smelled like expensive cologne. Bryce Morgan sat relaxed, one arm draped over the back of his chair, as if he were lounging at the country club rather than fighting for the dissolution of his 10-year marriage. He checked his Rolex, a Submariner, that cost more than the car his wife was currently living in, and smirked. Beside him sat Simon Kress, a divorce attorney whose billboards were plastered all over the Massachusetts Turnpike. Kress was a shark in a pinstripe suit, a man known for burying opponents under mountains of paperwork until they suffocated. On the other side of the aisle, the atmosphere was starkly different. Sabrina Morgan sat alone. The mahogany table in front of her looked enormous, emphasizing her isolation. She wore a simple grey dress, one she had owned for years. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. There was no stack of files in front of her, no paralegal whispering strategy in her ear, just a single notepad with a few trembling lines of handwriting. "Relax, Bryce," Kress whispered, though his voice carried in the quiet room. "This is a formality." Looking at her, she hasn't even filed a response to the motion for summary judgment. We'll be at lunch by noon. Bryce chuckled a low, throaty sound that grated on Sabrina's ears. I almost feel bad for her, Simon. Almost. She actually thinks crying to the judge is a legal strategy. "Mr. Morgan, please compose yourself," the bailiff warned from the corner, though he didn't look up from his phone. The heavy oak door behind the judge's bench opened, and the room shuffled to its feet. "All rise," the bailiff droned. "The Honorable Judge Lawrence presiding." Judge Lawrence was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He was nearing 70 with thick spectacles and a hairline that had receded in retreat from his formidable eyebrows. He did not tolerate nonsense. He sat down, arranged his robe, and glared over his glasses at the courtroom. "Docket number 44, 902 Morgan v. Morgan," the judge announced, his voice booming without a microphone. "We are here for final arguments regarding asset division and alimony." He looked at the petitioner's table. "Mr. Kress, you are appearing for Mr. Morgan." "Ready and eager, Your Honor," Kress said, standing up and buttoning his jacket with a confident flourish. The judge turned his gaze to the left. He paused. He looked at the empty chairs beside Sabrina. He looked at the gallery behind her, which was empty save for a few bored law students. "Mrs. Morgan," Judge Lawrence said, his tone dropping an octave, "where is your counsel?" Sabrina stood up. Her legs felt like lead. She cleared her throat, but no sound came out. She tried again. I don't have one, Your Honor." A stifled laugh came from Bryce's side of the room. Judge Lawrence shot a sharp look at the husband, silencing him instantly. "Mrs. Morgan," the judge said, leaning forward, "this is a high-asset divorce case. Your husband is claiming sole ownership of the technology firm, the Marston estate, and the portfolio. He is also petitioning to deny alimony based on, he glanced at the file, alleged infidelity and financial gross negligence. Do you understand the gravity of proceeding pro se? You are walking into a lion's den without a spear. I understand, Your Honor. Sabrina said, her voice barely a whisper. I applied for legal aid, but I was denied because, on paper, I am still a joint owner of the company, even though I have no access to the accounts. A classic catch-22, the judge muttered. He looked at Cress. Mr. Cress, you blocked her access to liquid funds. Standard procedure to prevent dissipation of assets, Your Honor. Cress said smoothly. We have evidence that Mrs. Morgan has a spending problem. Sabrina gasped. That's a lie. I bought groceries. That's all. Order, the judge snapped. He looked at Sabrina with pity, but also with the rigid adherence to the schedule of the court. Mrs. Morgan, if you cannot afford counsel and you do not qualify for aid, I cannot manufacture a lawyer for you. We have delayed this hearing twice already. We must proceed. Bryce leaned over to Cress, whispering loud enough for Sabrina to hear. Watch this. She's going to beg. It's pathetic. Sabrina squeezed her eyes shut. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She was 34 years old, educated and capable, yet Bryce had spent the last 5 years slowly dismantling her reality until she felt like a child. He had isolated her from her friends. He had told her that her family hated her. He had convinced her that she was nothing without him. Mrs. Morgan, are you ready to present your opening statement? The judge asked. Sabrina looked down at her notepad. It just said, tell the truth. Yes, Your Honor. Very well. The judge sighed, opening a fresh folder. Mr. Cress, you may begin. Simon Cress walked to the center of the courtroom, treating the floor like a stage. He didn't use notes. He knew exactly how to destroy a person's character, and he enjoyed it. Your Honor, Cress began, his voice rich and baritone. We are here today to correct a mistake. The mistake of a brilliant, hard-working man, my client Bryce Morgan, who married a woman he thought was a partner, but who turned out to be a parasite. Sabrina flinched, as if she had been slapped. The evidence will show, Cress continued, pacing back and forth, that while Mr. Morgan was building Morgan Tech from a garage startup into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, Sabrina Morgan contributed nothing. 0 capital, 0 intellectual property, 0 labor. That's not true, Sabrina whispered to herself. I wrote the original business plan. I worked 2 jobs to pay the rent while he coded. Furthermore, Cress raised his voice, drowning out her internal monologue. We will present bank records showing erratic withdrawals. Thousands of dollars vanished. We believe she is hiding assets or worse, funding a secret addiction. Because of this financial betrayal, we ask that the prenuptial agreement which she signed willingly be enforced to the letter. She leaves with what she came in, with nothing. Cress turned and pointed a manicured finger at Sabrina. She plays the victim, Your Honor. Look at her. The modest dress. The tears. It is a performance. Underneath that act is a woman who refused to sign the divorce papers for 6 months, simply to bleed my client dry of legal fees. Bryce nodded solemnity from the table, looking the picture of the aggrieved victim. Mr. Cress, the judge interrupted. You mentioned infidelity in your brief. Yes, Your Honor. Cress lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. We have text messages, ambiguous perhaps to the untrained eye, but clear in their intent. Late-night communications with a man named Dave. Sabrina stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. Dave is my brother. He's in rehab. I was sending him money for treatment. Objection, Cress roared. The respondent is testifying out of turn. Sustained, Judge Lawrence barked. Mrs. Morgan, sit down. You will have your turn. Sabrina sank back into her chair. She felt small. Every word Cress said was a twisted version of the truth. Yes, she withdrew money to pay for Bryce's gambling debts so his investors wouldn't find out. Yes, she texted Dave to save his life. But she had no proof. Bryce had wiped the cloud backups. He had changed the passwords. She was drowning. Cress finished his opening statement with a smirk. In conclusion, Your Honor, we ask for a full judgment in favor of Mr. Morgan. No alimony. No division of the company. A clean break. The room went silent. Bryce leaned back and winked at Sabrina. It was a subtle movement, just a flicker of his eyelid. But it carried a message: I own you. I own this room. Mrs. Morgan, the judge said, his voice weary. Your opening statement. Please keep it brief. Sabrina stood up. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold her paper. She placed her hands flat on the table to steady them. Your Honor, she began, her voice cracking. I don't speak legal. I don't know the words for what he's doing, but I know what the truth is. She looked at Bryce. He wasn't even looking at her. He was picking lint off his sleeve. I built that company too, she said, tears hot in her eyes. I edited every proposal. I managed the books for the first 3 years. I didn't take a salary because we put everything back into the business. And now he says I did nothing. He says I'm a thief. She took a deep breath. I don't have a lawyer because he froze our joint account the day he filed. I don't have my files because he changed the locks on the house while I was at the grocery store. I am here with nothing but my word. And your word, Cress interjected from his seat, is worth very little without evidence, Mrs. Morgan. Mr. Cress, one more outburst and I will hold you in contempt, Judge Lawrence warned. Sabrina looked at the judge. I just want what is fair. I gave him 10 years of my life. I just want to start over. It was a weak opening. She knew it. The judge knew it. It was emotional, not factual. In a court of law, emotion loses to documentation every time. And Bryce had all the documents. The morning dragged on, turning into a slow-motion execution. Cress called his first witness, a forensic accountant paid for by Bryce. The man and Mr. Henderson projected spreadsheets onto a screen. He used a laser pointer to circle unexplained cash outflows. As you can see, Your Honor, Henderson droned misses. Morgan withdrew $4,000 on September 12th. There is no receipt. I paid his bookie, Sabrina shouted, unable to help herself. Mrs. Morgan. The judge slammed his gavel. This is your final warning. But he's lying, Sabrina cried, tears finally spilling over. Bryce has a gambling problem. He plays high-stakes poker at the Sapphire Club. That money was to stop them from breaking his legs. Bryce laughed softly, shaking his head. Cress stood up, looking bored. Your Honor, this is slander. My client is a respected CEO. He does not frequent underground poker games. This is exactly the kind of hysterical fabrication we are dealing with. Do you have proof of these debts, Mrs. Morgan? The judge asked. No. Sabrina sobbed. He made me pay in cash. He said it leaves no trail. Convenient, Cress quipped. The judge took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at the clock. It was 11:45 a.m. Mrs. Morgan. Judge Lawrence said, his tone resigned. The court is sympathetic to the stress of divorce. However, allegations require substantiation. Mr. Kress has provided bank records, affidavits, and a signed prenuptial agreement. You have provided tears. The judge began to stack his papers. It looked like he was preparing to issue a ruling from the bench, cutting the trial short. I am inclined to grant the petitioner's motion for a summary judgment, the judge said. Bryce slammed his hand on the table in triumph. Yes? Sabrina felt the world spin. It was over. She would be homeless. She would be branded a liar. Bryce had won. He had mocked her for having no lawyer, and he was right. She was powerless. Wait, Sabrina whispered. Please. Unless. The judge paused, looking at the door. There is any other business? Just the ruling, Your Honor, Kress said, smiling like a Cheshire cat. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open, they boomed. It sounded like a gunshot. The entire room jumped. Even the judge looked up, startled. Standing in the doorway was a figure that seemed to suck the light out of the hallway. It was a woman. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, but she stood with a posture that made her look 7 feet tall. She wore a tailored black suit that cost more than Bryce's entire wardrobe. Her hair was silver, pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. She carried a leather briefcase that looked battered and dangerous. But it was her eyes that froze the room. They were blue, icy, and currently fixed on Simon Kress. The bailiff, a large man named Officer Miller, stepped forward. Ma'am, you can't just barge in here. Court is in session. The woman didn't even look at the bailiff. She simply held up a hand, a gesture of absolute command, and continued walking down the center aisle. Her heels clicked against the floor with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. Click, click, click. Who is this? Bryce whispered to Kress. Is this a witness? Kress was squinting. The color was draining from his face. No. He whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. That's not a witness. The woman reached the gate that separated the gallery from the litigation area. She pushed it open with one finger. She walked straight to Sabrina's table. Sabrina looked up, her eyes wide. She hadn't seen this woman in 15 years, not since she ran away with Bryce against her family's wishes. Mom, Sabrina whispered. The woman didn't look at Sabrina yet. She placed her briefcase on the table with a heavy thud. She turned to the judge. Margaret Fitzgerald, the woman announced. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the resonance of a cello. Entering an appearance as lead counsel for the respondent Sabrina Morgan. The courtroom went deadly silent. Judge Lawrence, who had been grumpy and impatient all morning, slowly put his glasses back on. He leaned over the bench, his eyes wide. Margaret Fitzgerald, the judge asked, his voice cracking slightly. The Margaret Fitzgerald, from the Southern District. The same, she said. She turned her head slowly to look at Bryce Morgan. Bryce felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I apologize for my tardiness, Your Honor, Margaret said, unclasping her briefcase. My flight from Zurich was delayed, but I believe I am just in time to stop a robbery in progress. Kress stood up, but his knees were shaking. Objection. This is irregular. You can't just walk in the middle of a trial. Margaret turned to Kress. She smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile a wolf gives a wounded rabbit. Mr. Kress, she said, I suggest you sit down before you say something that gets you disbarred before lunch." Judge Lawrence stared at the woman standing before him. The courtroom, previously a stage for Simon Cress's arrogance, had transformed into something else entirely. It felt like a church, or perhaps an execution chamber, awaiting the final verdict. "Ms. Fitzgerald," Judge Lawrence stammered, a rare display of uncertainty for the veteran jurist. "The court accepts your appearance. However, we are in the middle of the petitioner's case in chief. You are very late." Margaret Fitzgerald smoothed the front of her jacket. She didn't look flustered. She looked like she had arrived exactly when she intended to. "Late is relative, Your Honor," she replied coolly. "Justice has been delayed in this room for months due to the obfuscation tactics of opposing counsel. I am merely here to speed things up." She turned to Sabrina. Sabrina was frozen, her mouth slightly open. She hadn't spoken to her mother since the day she packed her bags 10 years ago to marry Bryce. Her mother had warned her. "He's a small man who wants to feel big," Margaret had said. "He will break you just to see the pieces." Sabrina had screamed that her mother was controlling and cold. They hadn't spoken since. "Mom," Sabrina whispered again, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Margaret looked down at her daughter. For a fleeting second, the icy mask slipped, revealing a depth of pain and regret that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Sit up straight, Sabrina," Margaret said softly. "Do not let them see you slouch. We are Morgans. Well, you are a Fitzgerald. Act like it." Bryce leaned over to Cress, his face flushed with irritation. "Simon, do something. Who is this old woman? Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Simon Cress was sweating. He wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "Bryce, shut up," he hissed. "That is Margaret Fitzgerald. They call her the Guillotine in New York. She was the lead prosecutor on the Omnicorp fraud case in the 90s. She retired to Zurich, but my God, she's legendary. She doesn't lose. She destroys. She's just a lawyer." Bryce scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "I pay you to be better." "Your Honor." Cress stood up, his voice squeaking slightly. "We object to this surprise appearance. We have not received discovery from Ms. Fitzgerald. We don't know what she intends to present. This is trial by ambush." Margaret laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Ambush." She walked toward Cress's table. She didn't stop until she was leaning over him, her hands resting on his papers. "Mr. Cress, you froze my daughter's assets, so she couldn't hire counsel. You filed motions ex parte to keep her in the dark. You have bullied a woman who cannot afford a sandwich, let alone a deposition. Do not speak to me of ambush. I invented the ambush." She turned back to the judge. "I move to recall Mr. Henderson, the forensic accountant, to the stand," Margaret said. "I have a few questions regarding his selective blindness." Judge Lawrence nodded vigorously. "Granted. Mr. Henderson, please take the stand." Mr. Henderson, the accountant who had just confidently testified that Sabrina was a thief, looked nervous. He shuffled back to the witness box, avoiding Margaret's gaze. Margaret approached the stand. She didn't hold any papers. She just stared at him until he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice pleasant but dangerous. "You are a certified forensic accountant, correct?" "Yes," he said. "And you swore under oath that you analyzed the Morgan joint accounts and found unexplained cash withdrawals by my client, implying she was stealing from the marriage." "That is what the data shows," Henderson said, gaining a little confidence. "Numbers don't lie." Numbers don't lie, Margaret repeated. But people do. You identified a withdrawal of $4,000 on September the 12th. You marked it as suspicious, unknown. Yes, there was no receipt. Margaret reached into her battered leather briefcase. She pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. Tell me, Mr. Henderson, in your thorough investigation, did you bother to cross-reference the GPS data from Mr. Morgan's car on the night of September 12th? No. That's not part of a standard financial audit. It is when you are looking for the truth, Margaret snapped. If you had, you would have seen that Mr. Morgan's vehicle was parked at 4400 Industrial Way from 10:00 p.m. to 3:00 a.m. Do you know what business is located at that address? Henderson swallowed. No. It is an unregistered gaming establishment known as the Pit. Margaret said, her voice rising. And do you know who owns the debt that was paid in cash that night? A Mr. Rico Valles, a loan shark. Objection, Kress yelled. Hearsay conjecture. I have the police report from a raid conducted on the Pit 2 weeks ago. Margaret slammed a document onto the judge's bench. Mr. Morgan's name was in the ledger confiscated by the Vice Squad. The ledger lists a $4,000 payment on September the 12th, the exact amount my daughter withdrew. She turned back to Henderson. So, Mr. Henderson, did my daughter steal that money? Or was she sent as a courier to pay off her husband's illegal gambling debt so his knees wouldn't be broken? Henderson turned pale. He looked at Bryce. Bryce was staring at the table, his jaw clenched tight. I was not provided with that context, Henderson stammered. Because you didn't look for it. Margaret said, her voice dripping with disdain. You were paid to find a narrative, not the facts. No further questions. Sabrina watched in awe. She had spent months trying to explain this to people, and no one listened. Her mother had walked in and dismantled the lie in 5 minutes. Margaret walked back to the table and sat down. She didn't look at Sabrina. She was focused, intense, like a predator tracking a scent. This is just the warm-up, Margaret whispered to Sabrina. Don't cry yet. We have work to do. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from a funeral to a gladiatorial arena. Judge Lawrence was leaning forward, fascinated. The law students in the back row were texting their friends furiously. Simon Kress looked like he was trying to figure out how to escape through a window. Mr. Kress, the judge said, do you have any redirect for Mr. Henderson? No, Your Honor, Kress mumbled. We move to the next issue. The infidelity. Kress was desperate. He needed to pivot away from the money. He needed to dirty Sabrina's name again. Very well, the judge said. Kress stood up, regaining some of his composure. Your Honor, the financial dispute is messy as they often are, but the moral failing is clear. We have logs of hundreds of text messages between Mrs. Morgan and a man listed as Dave. These messages occurred late at night. They contained phrases like, I love you, I'm scared, and I'll get you the money. This is clear evidence of an affair. Sabrina flinched. The Dave situation was the most painful part of the last year. Her brother David had relapsed into heroin addiction. She had been trying to get him into a private facility without Bryce finding out, because Bryce had threatened to cut off her family entirely if she gave them 1 red cent. Margaret stood up. She didn't object. She just held out a hand. May I see these damning logs? She asked. Kress handed them over with a sneer. It's all there. The romance of the century. Margaret put on a pair of reading glasses. She scanned the pages. She sighed a sound of profound disappointment. Mr. Kress, she said, taking off her glasses. Did you subpoena the phone number associated with Dave? We didn't need to, Kress said. The content speaks for itself. Lazy, Margaret said. Sloppy and lazy. She walked to the center of the room. Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Aris Thorne. The doors opened again. A man in a white coat, looking confused and holding a clipboard, walked in. Who is this? Cress demanded. He's not on the witness list. Rebuttal witness, Margaret said calmly. Allowed when the petitioner opens the door to character attacks. You opened the door, Mr. Cress. I'm just walking through it. Dr. Thorne took the stand. He was sworn in. Dr. Thorne, Margaret said, please state your occupation. I am the medical director of the Greystone Rehabilitation Center in Vermont, the doctor said. And do you recognize the name David Fitzgerald? Yes, the doctor nodded. He is currently a patient in our intensive recovery unit. And is he related to the respondent Sabrina Morgan? Yes, he is her brother. Margaret picked up the text log. Dr. Thorne, I'm going to read a text sent from Sabrina to David on October the 4th. It says, I love you, please stay strong, I will get the money. In your professional opinion, given the context of a patient in withdrawal, does this sound like a romantic affair? Objection, Cress shouted. Calls for speculation. Overruled, Judge Lawrence said. The witness is an expert in addiction recovery. No, Dr. Thorne said sadly. That sounds like a sister trying to keep her brother from killing himself. Margaret turned to the courtroom. She held up the log. My daughter was not sleeping with another man, Your Honor. She was saving her brother's life. A brother, I might add, that Mr. Morgan forbade her from seeing because he thought addiction was embarrassing for his corporate image. She threw the log onto Cress's table. It landed with a slap. Shame on you, Margaret said. Shame on you for twisting a family tragedy into a sordid affair to save your client a few dollars in alimony. Cress shrank back. Bryce, however, was turning red. He stood up. She's lying, Bryce shouted, losing his cool. She was sending money to everyone. She's irresponsible. That's why I took the company accounts. She was draining us dry. Sit down, Mr. Morgan, the judge roared. No, Bryce yelled. I built Morgan Teched me. She's just a leech. I have the records. I have the IP. Margaret turned slowly to face Bryce. A small, cold smile played on her lips. She had been waiting for this. She had been waiting for him to claim sole ownership of the company. Ah, Margaret said softly. The company. Morgan Tech. She walked back to her briefcase. She reached into a hidden compartment and pulled out a thick, bound document. It looked old. The paper was slightly yellowed. Mr. Morgan, Margaret said, holding the document like a weapon. You claim you wrote the source code for the proprietary algorithm that Morgan Tech is based on. The Morgan engine, I believe you call it. I did, Bryce spat. In my garage, while she was watching TV. Is that so? Margaret opened the document. Because I have here the original patent application, dated 6 years ago. Curiously, it was never filed with the U.S. Patent Office in this form. Do you know why? Bryce went silent. His eyes darted to the document. Because, Margaret continued, this version lists 2 inventors, Bryce Morgan and Sabrina Fitzgerald. The room gasped. Sabrina looked up, shocked. You found it, she whispered. I thought he burned it. He tried, Margaret said to her daughter, but you sent a digital copy to your father's email 6 years ago for safekeeping. You forgot. I didn't. Margaret turned to the judge. Your Honor, my client wrote the core logic for the algorithm. She has a master's degree in applied mathematics, a fact her husband conveniently left out of his opening statement. He forced her to remove her name from the patent application under duress, threatening to end the marriage if she didn't let him have the glory. She handed the document to the judge. This is proof of intellectual property fraud, and it implies that Morgan Tech is not just a marital asset. It is a partnership where my client is the 50% creator of the product. That means she doesn't just get half the value. She gets half the control. Bryce looked like he was going to be sick. He slumped into his chair. That's a draft. It doesn't mean anything. It means everything, Margaret said. But we aren't done yet, because while looking for this patent, I found something else. Something much, much worse. She turned to Cress. Mr. Cress, are you familiar with a company called Orion Consulting, registered in the Cayman Islands? Cress dropped his pen. It clattered loudly on the floor. I see you are, Margaret said. Your Honor, I request permission to connect my laptop to the courtroom display. I have a flow chart regarding money laundering that I think the IRS and this court will find very interesting. The courtroom descended into a hush so profound that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Margaret Fitzgerald stood at the center of the room, her silhouette sharp against the light of the projector screen that had descended from the ceiling with a mechanical whir. She moved with the deliberate, terrifying calm of an executioner adjusting the rope. She connected her laptop to the court's AV system. On the large screen, a complex diagram flickered to life. It was a web of lines, boxes, and arrows, sharp and clinical in black and white. It looked less like a financial report and more like a map of a subterranean tunnel system, one designed to hide things that didn't want to be found. This, Margaret announced, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness, is the anatomy of a theft. She pointed a laser clicker at a large box at the top of the hierarchy labeled Morgan Tech. We start here, the marital asset, the company my client helped build. She pressed the button, and a bright red arrow shot out from the main box, pointing to a smaller nondescript box labeled Orion Consulting. Every month for the past 18 months, Morgan Tech has wired exactly $50,000 to this entity Orion Consulting for server maintenance and high-level architectural oversight. A reasonable expense for a growing tech firm, one might argue. Margaret paused, turning to look at Bryce. He was staring at the screen, his face draining of color, his mouth slightly ajar. He looked like a man watching a slow-motion car crash involving his own vehicle. However, Margaret continued, her tone dropping an octave. I grew curious about Orion Consulting. I attempted to visit their headquarters. Do you know what I found, Your Honor? Judge Lawrence leaned forward, his eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. I am listening, Ms. Fitzgerald. I found a mailbox, she said flatly. Orion Consulting has no employees. It has no website. It has no servers to maintain. Its registered address is a P.O. box inside a shipping center in Georgetown, Grand Cayman. Simon Cress stood up, but his movement was jerky, lacking his usual shark-like grace. Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant corporate structuring. Companies outsource to offshore entities all the time for tax efficiency. This is outside the jurisdiction of a family court. Sit down, Mr. Cress, Judge Lawrence snapped, not looking away from the screen. If marital assets are flowing into a mailbox in the Caribbean, it is very much my jurisdiction. Margaret smiled, a cold, thin expression that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you, Your Honor, but the money doesn't stay in the mailbox. It moves. She clicked the remote again. The diagram expanded. A new line snaked away from Orion. Consulting crossing the ocean to a new box labeled Redstone Holdings. The sole signatory for the Orion account is this shell corporation, Redstone Holdings, and Redstone immediately wires the funds minus a small processing fee to a private numbered bank account in Zurich, Switzerland. The atmosphere in the room shifted from curiosity to heavy, suffocating tension. Swiss accounts were the stuff of spy novels and federal indictments. Now Swiss banks are notoriously secretive, Margaret said, pacing slowly before the judge's bench. They do not give up names easily. It is a fortress designed to protect anonymity. It is nearly impossible to connect a numbered account to a human being. She stopped pacing. She looked directly at Bryce, who was now gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. Unless, Margaret said softly, the owner of that account gets sloppy. Unless the owner is so arrogant, so convinced of his own invincibility that he uses that secret, untraceable account to pay his personal American credit card bill. She walked back to her table and picked up a single sheet of paper. She held it up like a smoking gun. I have here a subpoenaed statement from American Express. It is for a Centurion card, the black card, issued to Bryce Morgan. She placed the paper on the document scanner. It appeared on the big screen, magnified for everyone to see. A highlight circled a payment of $25,000. The source of the funds was listed clearly: wire transfer. UBS Zurich. Act 88902. The same account number receiving the funds from the shell company, Margaret declared. Miss Morgan has been siphoning corporate profits that are marital assets into a fake consulting firm, washing it through the Caymans, and depositing it into a secret personal account. He has stolen approximately $1.2 million from the marital estate in the last 18 months. All while standing in this courtroom under oath, telling you that his wife is a spendthrift who deserves to be destitute. The silence shattered. Bryce leaped to his feet, knocking his heavy oak chair backward with a deafening crash. "It's my money," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I earned it. I made the deals. I wrote the code. She just sat at home while I built an empire. She doesn't deserve a dime of it." "Mr. Morgan," Judge Lawrence roared, reaching for his gavel. "No!" Bryce's face was twisted ugly with entitlement and rage. "I did the work. I wasn't going to let her take half of my genius just because she signed a piece of paper 10 years ago. It's mine. And there it is," Margaret said, her voice cutting through his screaming like a knife. "Confession on the record." She turned away from Bryce, dismissing him as if he were already in handcuffs, and turned her sights on Simon Kress. The lawyer was frantically shoving papers into his briefcase, his face pale and sweaty. He looked like a rat trying to scurry off a sinking ship. "Mr. Kress," Margaret called out, "where are you going?" Kress froze. He looked up, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that wasn't there. I have a sudden conflict of interest. I must recuse myself immediately." "I imagine you do," Margaret said, walking toward him. "Because I noticed one final interesting detail about the incorporation papers for Orion Consulting." She clicked the remote one last time. The screen zoomed in on the bottom of the Cayman Islands registration document. There, in the field for registered agent, was a signature. "You didn't just represent him, did you, Mr. Kress?" Margaret asked, her voice lethal. "You set it up. You are the registered agent who filed the paperwork to hide these assets." The judge's head snapped toward the lawyer. The look on his face was terrifying. "Mr. Kress, did you facilitate the creation of an offshore vehicle to defraud this court?" Kress stammered, his hands shaking violently. I was merely acting on client instructions. I had no knowledge of the intent to— Liar! Bryce yelled, pointing a trembling finger at his own lawyer. It was your idea. You told me how to do it. You said, hide the money before you file, so she starves and settles for pennies. You charged me 10 grand just to set up the shell company. The courtroom erupted. The law students were gasping, whispering furiously. Sabrina watched in awe, her hand covering her mouth. The two men who had tormented her, who had made her feel small and powerless, were now tearing each other apart in a panic. Order! Order! Judge Lawrence bellowed, slamming his gavel down so hard the wood splintered. When the noise finally subsided, the judge looked at the two men. Bryce was red-faced and panting, standing amidst the wreckage of his defense. Cress was slumped in his chair, staring at the floor, a man who knew his career was over. In all my years, Judge Lawrence said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, I have never seen such a flagrant, disgusting display of deceit. He turned to the defense table. Ms. Fitzgerald, the judge said, his tone shifting to one of profound respect. Do you have any further evidence to present? Margaret slowly closed her laptop. She looked at Sabrina, and for a brief second, a small, proud smile touched her lips. She turned back to the judge. I think the rats eating each other is evidence enough. Your Honor, Margaret said calmly, the defense rests. Judge Lawrence did not call for a recess. He did not ask the bailiff to clear the room for deliberation. He simply sat back in his high leather chair, took a slow, deep breath, and uncapped his fountain pen. The sound of the cap clicking off echoed in the silent courtroom, like the cocking of a gun. He began to write. The scratching of his nib against the heavy legal paper was the only sound in the room for a full minute. Bryce Morgan sat frozen, his face a rictus of terror, sweat beading on his upper lip. He looked at Simon Cress, silently begging for a miracle, but his lawyer was staring fixedly at the floor, looking like a man praying for a sinkhole to open up and swallow him whole. Finally, Judge Lawrence set the pen down. He interlaced his fingers and looked over the rim of his glasses, his gaze heavy with judgment. In 30 years on the bench, Judge Lawrence began, his voice low, but vibrating with suppressed anger. I have presided over thousands of divorces. I have seen bitterness. I have seen petty squabbles. But I have never witnessed such a flagrant, coordinated effort to defraud this court-hide assets and psychologically dismantle a spouse as I have seen here today. Bryce opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised a single finger. The silence held. The court finds the petitioner Bryce Morgan has engaged in systemic financial fraud, perjury, and the willful dissipation of marital assets. The judge announced, his words falling like stones. The evidence presented by Ms. Fitzgerald is not merely compelling, it is damning. You didn't just hide money, Mr. Morgan. You stole the life your wife helped you build. Sabrina felt a hand squeeze hers under the table. She looked down. It was her mother's hand, strong and steady. Sabrina squeezed back her heart, hammering against her ribs. Therefore, the judge continued, picking up the order he had just drafted, I am granting the divorce immediately on the grounds of gross misconduct. But we are not done. We must address the division of assets. Bryce leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. This was it. The money. Due to Mr. Morgan's attempt to defraud the marital estate and his admission under oath that the respondent was a co-creator of the intellectual property, equitable distribution is no longer sufficient. I am applying a punitive adjustment. The judge looked directly at Bryce. I'm awarding Sabrina Morgan 100% of the marital home in Boston, free and clear of all encumbrances. Mr. Morgan, You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. You will take only your clothing and personal effects. Anything else stays." Bryce made a wet, choking sound. "My house. That's a $2 million property." "It was," the judge corrected coldly. "Now it is hers." "Furthermore," the judge said, shifting his gaze to the papers, "we come to the matter of Morgan Tech. You claimed it was yours alone. The patent application proves it otherwise. The funding structure proves otherwise." The judge paused, letting the tension stretch to a breaking point. "I am awarding Mrs. Morgan 60% ownership of Morgan Tech." The air left the room. 60%. Bryce whispered, his voice cracking. That's controlling interest. That's my company. I'm the CEO." "Not anymore," the judge said, his voice cutting like a razor. "With 60% of the shares, Mrs. Morgan effectively controls the board. She can appoint the CEO. She can fire the CEO. The company is hers, Mr. Morgan. You just work there if she decides to keep you." Bryce looked like he had been shot. His entire identity, his ego, his power, it was all wrapped up in that title. And in one sentence the judge had handed it to the woman Bryce had spent years calling useless. "As for your remaining 40%, the judge added, twisting the knife, "it will be placed in a blind trust administered by a third party of the court's choosing. This trust will be used to satisfy the retroactive alimony legal fees and the restitution for the funds you embezzled to the Caymans." "You can't do this!" Bryce shrieked, leaping to his feet. The chair crashed backward behind him. "This is a kangaroo court. She's nothing. She's a leech. I built everything. Mr. Morgan, sit down," the judge roared. "No!" Bryce yelled, his face turning a violent shade of purple. He pointed a shaking finger at Sabrina. "You planned this, you and that witch. You think you can take my company? I'll burn it to the ground first. Do you hear me? I'll burn it all down." Judge Lawrence didn't hesitate. He slammed his gavel down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Bailiff, Officer Miller, who had been waiting for this moment all morning, moved with startling speed. He was across the room in 2 strides. "Mr. Morgan, hands behind your back," Miller barked. "Get off me!" Bryce struggled, flailing his arms. "I am Bryce Morgan. I am a tech mogul. You can't touch me." The struggle was brief and humiliating. Miller spun Bryce around and slammed him face first onto the mahogany table, the same table where he had sat laughing just hours before. The metallic snick-snick of handcuffs echoed through the stunned courtroom. "Bryce Morgan, I am holding you in contempt of court," Judge Lawrence said, his voice steely calm. "Furthermore, based on your outburst and the extensive evidence of flight risk via offshore accounts, I am revoking your bail before it is even set. You will be remanded to the county jail until a hearing can be set regarding the criminal fraud charges." As the bailiff hauled Bryce upright, the disgraced husband looked at Sabrina one last time. His hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was rumpled, and his eyes were wild with fear. He looked for the fear in Sabrina's eyes, the submission he was used to. He didn't find it. Sabrina met his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked at him with a profound, quiet indifference. He was no longer her tormentor. He was just a small, angry man in handcuffs. "Take him away," the judge ordered. As Bryce was dragged out the side door, still shouting obscenities, the judge turned his attention to the second empty chair at the defense table. "Mr. Kress!" Simon Kress looked up. He was trembling so badly, his teeth were audibly chattering. "I am referring the transcripts of today's proceedings. To the State Bar Association and the District Attorney's Office, Judge Lawrence said with a look of pure disgust. You facilitated fraud. You suborned perjury. You are a disgrace to this profession. I expect your license will be suspended by the end of the business day. Kress didn't argue. He didn't speak. He simply slumped in his chair, a ruined man. Court is adjourned, Judge Lawrence said, banging the gavel one final time. The courtroom began to empty. The law students in the back were buzzing, whispering excitedly about the legendary takedown they had just witnessed. But at the petitioner's table, Sabrina sat still, listening to the silence. It was a beautiful sound. It sounded like freedom. "Mum," Sabrina said softly. Margaret Fitzgerald was busy packing her briefcase. She snapped the latches shut with a sharp click, her face still composed in that impenetrable mask she wore like armor. "You were brilliant," Sabrina said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life." Margaret paused. She took a breath, and for the first time since walking through the doors, her shoulders slumped slightly. She turned to look at her daughter. The guillotine melted away, leaving behind a mother who looked tired, relieved, and fiercely proud. "I didn't save you, Sabrina," Margaret said, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from Sabrina's forehead. "I just handed you the sword. You were the one who had to swing it." "I thought you wouldn't come," Sabrina admitted, tears finally spilling over. "After everything I said, after I left with him." "I was angry," Margaret admitted, her voice rough. "I was furious. I raised you to be a giant, Sabrina. I raised you to command rooms to solve impossible problems. It broke my heart to see you shrink yourself to fit into that small man's pocket." "I'm sorry," Sabrina whispered. "I was so stupid." "Stop," Margaret said firmly, cupping Sabrina's chin and lifting her head. "Do not apologize for surviving. You fell into a trap. It happens to the best of us. The test isn't avoiding the trap, Sabrina. The test is clawing your way out." Margaret picked up her battered leather briefcase, the weapon that had slain giants in courtrooms for 40 years. "Now," Margaret said, checking her watch, "I have a car waiting downstairs. I am going to the Ritz for a martini. A very dry martini with 3 olives. And then we are going to order room service and discuss corporate restructuring." Sabrina blinked, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Corporate restructuring. You are the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm now," Margaret said, a glint of steel returning to her blue eyes. "And we have a board meeting to prepare for. If you're going to run Morgan Tech, you need a better wardrobe, and we need to purge the rest of Bryce's cronies from the payroll." Sabrina stood up. She smoothed down her simple grey dress. She felt different, taller, lighter. "I think I'd like that martini," Sabrina said. "Good," Margaret said, opening the heavy oak gate and holding it for her daughter. "After you, Madam CEO." They walked out of the courtroom together, side by side. The hallway was flooded with afternoon sunlight, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Sabrina Morgan took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of a new life. Bryce had thought she was weak because she was alone. He had forgotten the most ancient rule of the wild: never corner a cub, because the mother is never far behind, and when she strikes, she doesn't miss. And that is how the guillotine fell on Bryce Morgan. He thought his money, his arrogance, and his expensive suit could buy him victory. He mocked his wife for her silence, never realizing that she wasn't defeated. She was just waiting for backup. Sabrina didn't just win a lawsuit in that courtroom. She reclaimed her dignity, proving that while a lie can sprint, the truth runs a marathon. Bryce lost his company, his reputation, and his freedom, all because he underestimated the quiet woman sitting across the aisle. If you enjoyed this story of intense karma and family justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. What would you do if you were in Sabrina's shoes? Would you keep the company or sell it? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.